The morning light came through the kitchen window the same way it always had, soft and golden, falling across the oak table where I'd eaten 31 years of breakfasts. I stood there holding my coffee with both hands, watching dust move slowly through the light, and I thought, this is what 31 years looks like. Not fireworks. Not a grand declaration, just morning light on a table, and a woman who knew every creak in every floorboard of a house that no longer felt like hers. I turned 63 in March. My husband forgot. That wasn't new. My husband, the man I'd built a life with since I was 32 years old, had been forgetting things about me for a long time. My birthday, the name of the firm where I'd worked for 12 years before we married, the fact that I had designed 3 of the buildings visible from the highway just outside of Charlotte. He had a habit of introducing me at dinner parties as my wife, Margaret, with a small pause before my name, as if he had to locate it first. I used to think that was just him. Distracted, busy. Successful men were like that, I told myself. My daughter told me the same thing whenever I brought it up, gently, over the phone. Dad's just Dad? Mom? You know how he is. I did know. I just didn't know everything. The earring was not what gave it away. There was no single earring, no lipstick on a collar, no forgotten receipt. What gave it away was a Sunday afternoon in November, when I came home early from visiting my college roommate in Asheville, and I heard my husband on the back porch, his voice low and warm in a way it hadn't been with me in years. I stood in the hallway and listened to him say, "She never has to know. We've been careful." And then a laugh, bright and familiar and wrong. My sister Claire is 12 years younger than me. She has always been the pretty one, the easy one, the one our mother worried about less because the world seemed to arrange itself around her without effort. I had learned to love that about her, eventually. It had taken work, but I had done the work, the way I did most things, carefully, completely, without making a fuss. I walked back out the front door. I sat in my car in the driveway for 45 minutes. Then I drove to the grocery store, bought the things we needed for the week, came home, and made dinner. I did not say a word. That was 8 months before everything changed. 8 months in which I did my research, made my calls, and remembered something I had never actually forgotten. I was an architect. I had been building things carefully, completely, without making a fuss since before my husband knew my last name. Let me tell you about the trust. In 1987, 2 years before I married my husband, I purchased a small parcel of land outside of Brevard, North Carolina. I was 29 years old, newly licensed, and I had saved every spare dollar from my first 3 years of work. It wasn't much, 6 acres and a falling-down farmhouse that my mother thought I was crazy to buy. I fixed the farmhouse myself on weekends. I drew the plans, hired the trades, project managed every nail and beam. By the time I married, it was a beautiful property worth 3 times what I'd paid. Before the wedding, on the advice of a mentor at my firm, a sharp woman named Dolores who had been through a divorce of her own and knew things, I placed that property and everything connected to it into a revocable living trust. My trust. My name only. I did it quietly, with an estate attorney in Brevard who had no connection to my husband's world, and I did not discuss it at the rehearsal dinner. Over the years, I added to it, carefully, methodically, revenue from the farmhouse, which I had converted into a rental property, a small investment account I'd opened with inheritance money from my grandmother, proceeds from a consulting project I'd taken on under my maiden name in 2009, when my husband was too busy expanding his commercial real estate portfolio to notice what I was doing with my weekends. By the time I stood in that hallway and heard my husband's voice go warm for someone who was not me, the trust held assets worth just over $1.4 million. He did not know it existed. He knew about my grandmother's money. He assumed I'd spent it. I'd let him assume that. He knew I'd done some consulting work over the years, and he'd always waved it off as a hobby. What he did not know, because I had never told him and he had never asked, was that I had been tending something of my own for 31 years, the same way a gardener tends a garden a little at a time, season by season, so quietly that no one walking past the fence would notice how much had grown. The 8 months after that November afternoon were the most focused of my life. I called Dolores first. Even though she was semi-retired and living outside of Tucson, she listened to everything I said, asked 3 questions, and then gave me the name of a family law attorney in Charlotte named Patricia, who had, in Dolores's words, the patience of a saint and the instincts of a shark. I called Patricia the next morning. Patricia confirmed what I had already suspected. The trust was separate property, established before the marriage, never commingled with marital funds, properly documented and maintained. My husband had no legal claim to it. The 6 acres in Brevard, the rental income, the investment account, none of it was part of the marital estate. What about the rest? I asked. That, Patricia said, is where it gets interesting. Over the previous 3 years, my husband had been quietly moving money, not all of it, and not so quickly that it looked intentional, but Patricia's forensic accountant, a quiet man named Gerald who wore the same gray cardigan to every meeting, found the trail without much difficulty. A beach property in Hilton Head transferred to an LLC. A joint savings account drained in increments just below the threshold that would trigger bank notification. A whole life insurance policy mine as beneficiary quietly changed. He had changed the beneficiary to my sister. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it the way you sit with something that is both a complete surprise and no surprise at all. I did not cry in Patricia's office. I waited until I was in my car, and then I cried for approximately 6 minutes, and then I drove home and made dinner. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not what my husband expected. It was a Wednesday evening in late July. Our daughter was in Portland. She had moved there 3 years ago and called every Sunday, reliably, in the way that good children do when they feel guilty for leaving. The house was quiet. I had made the pasta dish my husband liked, the one with the Italian sausage, and I had set the table properly, with cloth napkins, because I had always done things properly. He sat down, looked at his plate, and said, without looking up, "Yes," I said. "We do." He had clearly prepared something. He was a commercial real estate developer. He was comfortable with negotiation, with the performance of reasonableness. He talked for nearly 4 minutes. The marriage had run its course. We had grown apart. He wanted to be honest with me rather than let things drag on. He hoped we could be adults about this. He mentioned Claire once, obliquely, as someone who had helped him understand what he was missing, and I watched his hands while he talked, steady, composed, already counting his winnings. When he finished, I slid the envelope across the table. He opened it. He looked at the first page for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. "Divorce papers?" he said. "Already filed," I said. "Patricia Morse is my attorney. You'll want to get someone good." The composure cracked just slightly. When did you? Gerald found the Hilton Head LLC, I said, and the savings account, and the insurance policy. I kept my voice even. I had practiced this. Patricia tells me that fraudulent transfer of marital assets is taken quite seriously in North Carolina. He set the papers down. He picked them up again. Something was moving across his face that I recognized from 31 years of watching him negotiate the rapid recalculation of position. "You don't know everything," he said. "I know enough," I said. "Eat your pasta. It's getting cold." He did not eat his pasta. He made 3 phone calls from the back porch. I could hear the low, urgent voice, different now from the warm, easy voice I'd heard in November, and then he came back inside and told me that his attorney would be in touch, and that I should understand this was going to be complicated. "I imagine it will be," I said. He moved out that weekend. He went to Claire's apartment in Dilworth, which I had expected, and which clarified certain things that I suppose I had needed clarified. My daughter called on Sunday, her regular time, and I told her what had happened, most of it, in the straightforward way I tried to do most things. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Mom? How long have you known?" "A while," I said. "Are you okay?" I thought about that honestly. "I think I'm going to be better than okay," I said. "But ask me again in 6 months." The discovery process was, as my husband had promised, complicated. His attorney, a broad-shouldered man named Decker, who specialized in high-asset divorce, came to the first mediation session with what Patricia quietly described to me afterward as a lot of confidence for someone who hasn't read the full documentation. Decker argued that my consulting income should be considered marital property. He argued that the trust had been informally commingled because I had, on 2 occasions over 31 years, deposited small amounts from the joint account before moving them back out. He was thorough and he was aggressive and he was, Gerald gently pointed out, incorrect on both counts. What Decker apparently had not expected was the prenuptial agreement. I had forgotten about it, truthfully, for long stretches of time. It had been Dolores's suggestion back in 1989, not because either of us expected the marriage to fail, but because I had assets going in, and she believed women with assets should protect them. My husband had signed it without much fuss, the way young men sometimes sign things without reading carefully when they believe the future belongs entirely to them. He had signed a document stating clearly that any property held in my name or in trust established in my name prior to the marriage would remain solely mine in the event of dissolution, including appreciation and income derived from that property. He had also, in a clause that his 28-year-old self had apparently skimmed past, signed a waiver of any claim to assets transferred to third parties in the 12 months prior to filing, in cases where fraudulent transfer could be demonstrated. Gerald demonstrated it without breaking a sweat. The Hilton Head property came back into the marital estate. The LLC was dissolved. The savings account withdrawals were calculated and credited. The insurance beneficiary change was reversed by court order within 3 weeks. Claire called me once during that period. She called from a number I didn't recognize, and I let it ring, and she left a voicemail that I have listened to exactly once, and will not describe in detail except to say that it contained both an apology and an explanation, and that the explanation was somehow worse than the affair. I did not call her back. I have not called her back. My mother, who is 81 and sharp as she has ever been, called me the day after the voicemail and said, "I always worried about that girl," which was as close to an apology on Claire's behalf as I was going to receive, and I accepted it as such. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday morning in February, 11 months after I'd slid that envelope across the dinner table. My husband received his share of the marital assets, the equity in the Charlotte house, half of the joint retirement accounts, his own business holdings, which were considerable. He was not left destitute. That was never the point. The point was that he received nothing from the trust, nothing from the Brevard property, which had appreciated to nearly double its last appraised value, nothing from 31 years of quiet, careful building that he had walked past every day without once thinking to ask about. He had spent 11 months and significant legal fees trying to reach something that had never been his to begin with. Decker, Patricia told me, had not taken it gracefully. I signed the final papers at Patricia's office, and she walked me to the elevator and shook my hand and said, "It was a pleasure." I believed her. I took the elevator down to the parking garage and sat in my car for a moment, not crying this time, just sitting. The case was over. The marriage was over. I was 63 years old, and it was February, and the rest of my life was just beginning to come into focus. The farmhouse in Brevard had been rented for years to a series of quiet tenants academics on sabbatical, a retired couple from Michigan who stayed 4 years and left the place immaculate. It was empty now. I had let the last lease expire in January without renewing it, partly on instinct, partly because I had started to think about what Dolores had said to me years ago, when I'd first called her from a parking lot in Charlotte with my hands shaking. "Margaret," she had said, "the thing about building something quietly is that when everything else falls down, you still have what you built." I drove up to Brevard on a Saturday in March, my birthday, which I celebrated alone and did not mind celebrating alone. The 6 acres were still and cold and beautiful. The farmhouse smelled like old wood and possibility. I walked through every room and looked at every beam I had measured, every window I had placed for light at a specific time of day, and I understood something I had been too busy to understand for 30 years. I had always known how to make a home. The problem was that I had been making one for someone who never looked up long enough to see what I'd done. I called my daughter that night from the porch, watching the tree line go dark against a pale sky. "I think I'm going to renovate," I said. "The Brevard place?" She knew about it now. She had cried, on a separate call, about a lot of things she hadn't known. We were still working through it the way mothers and daughters work through things imperfectly, honestly, with long pauses that meant more than most sentences. "The Brevard place," I said. "I want to take it apart and put it back together properly. I have some ideas." She laughed a little. "Of course you do. I was thinking I might live there while I work. It's been a while since I designed something for myself." "Mom," she said. "What?" I think that's the first time in years I've heard you sound like yourself. I sat with that for a moment, watching the sky. It was cold and the stars were very clear, and I was 63 years old, sitting on the porch of something I had built. And she was right. I did sound like myself. I had been so quiet for so long, careful and methodical and quiet, moving through 31 years of a life that had been gradually shaped around someone else's needs and assumptions, that I had nearly forgotten what my own voice sounded like when it had nothing to apologize for. I sound like this, I thought. I sound like this. The renovation took 8 months. I hired a young contractor named Ellis, who had gone to the same architecture program I had 35 years earlier, and who treated my drawings with the seriousness they deserved. We opened up the back of the house to the mountain view I had always intended but never fully committed to. We replaced the windows with something that caught the morning light properly. I designed a studio space off the east side where I could work, with a drafting table by a window and shelves for the books that had been in storage since the Charlotte house sold. I did a small amount of paid consulting work during those months, enough to stay current, and I discovered that the professional world had not moved on without me as thoroughly as I had feared. A firm in Asheville asked me to consult on a mixed-use project. I said yes. I drove down on Thursdays, sat in their glass-walled conference room, told them what I thought, and drove back. It was clean and uncomplicated in a way that work had not been when I was also managing a household around someone else's schedule. My husband, I heard through a mutual friend, had moved in with Claire. I heard this on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in my studio watching Ellis's crew install the last of the new windows. And I felt almost nothing except a mild, distantly curious sense of completion, the way you feel when you finish the last page of a book you've been reading for a long time. I wished them nothing specific, not happiness, not misery. I simply did not think about them very much, which was its own kind of gift. What I thought about, in the long evenings on the porch with the tree line going dark, was the version of myself who had stood in that hallway in November and heard a voice go warm for someone who wasn't me. She had been so still. She had stood there in her coat with her keys in her hand, and she had absorbed something devastating, and she had walked back out the front door without making a sound, because she had spent 30 years practicing that particular stillness, that particular silence, that particular way of taking damage without letting it show. I understood her. I did not blame her, but I was not her anymore. I was the woman who had kept 6 acres and a falling-down farmhouse for 31 years because something in her knew, even at 29, that a person needs a piece of solid ground that belongs only to them. I was the woman who had read the prenuptial agreement carefully and asked the attorney 3 follow-up questions and then filed it in a fireproof box in the back of a closet where it had waited, patient and exact, for 3 decades. I was the woman who had called Dolores from a parking lot at 63 years old and been told exactly what she needed to hear. I was the woman who, on a clear, cold evening in the mountains of North Carolina, stood in a house she had designed herself and looked at the view she had always intended and thought, "This is mine. All of this is mine. It has always been mine." My daughter came to visit in November, almost exactly a year after the beginning of the end. She drove up on a Friday afternoon with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, who were 4 and 7 and had opinions about everything. We ate at the big table I'd had made from reclaimed oak. We sat on the porch in the cold, and my daughter wrapped herself in the blanket I kept out there and looked at the mountains and said, almost to herself, "I didn't know it looked like this." "I always knew it would," I said. She turned to look at me. The firelight caught her face in a way that reminded me of when she was very small, before she had all the adult words for complicated things. "Mom," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Were you scared? During all of it?" I thought about it honestly, the way I tried to do most things now. "Yes," I said. "I was scared in that hallway in November. I was scared the morning I called Patricia. I was scared signing those papers, even knowing what I knew." I looked at the tree line. But the fear was always quieter than the knowing. The knowing what I had. The knowing who I was. I paused. "Does that make sense?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said. "It actually does." The grandchildren came thundering back out from inside, the 7-year-old demanding to know if there were bats in the woods, and the 4-year-old attempting to follow a very patient dog that the neighbor's family had sent over at some point and that now appeared to live here. My daughter laughed. I laughed. The dog endured it all with remarkable composure. Later, after the children were in bed and my son-in-law had fallen asleep in front of the fireplace, my daughter and I sat outside in the cold with our wine, and she said, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the best I've ever seen you." I thought about that for a long moment. "I think I might be," I said. "I think I actually might be." There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not walk into rooms with its arms out. It does not make declarations or draw attention to how much it has endured. It is the strength of the woman who does the work every day, who reads the documents carefully, who opens the fireproof box when the time comes, who builds things slowly, quietly, across decades, not out of fear or bitterness, but because she has always understood, in some part of herself that no one else ever reached, that a person is more than what they are to the people who overlook them. I was 63 years old. I was a licensed architect. I had 6 acres and a renovated farmhouse and a studio with the right light at the right time of day. I had a daughter who called every Sunday, and a porch that faced the mountains, and a prenuptial agreement that had waited 31 years to say what I had always known. I had always been enough. I had simply, finally, stopped being quiet about it.